I bought that painting the day that I lost a job. And which is the worst time, but the best time to buy art.
Let's mark this moment forever.
That was about me reminding myself that I was about to do something really interesting.
Hey, I'm George, the co-founder of Bluethumb, and I'm joined by my colleague Connor. Welcome to the Art in My Home podcast.
We uncover the surprising stories from the art collections of unexpected guests.
Today's guest is Tim Ross. Tim's had a fascinating career, starting as a comedian on radio before becoming a design leader across books, TV, and a passionate advocate for mid-century modern architecture. Super excited to have Tim on the program. Hey, Tim.
G'day, guys. Thanks for having me along for the ride.
Let's start on a topic that is kind of very dear to your heart, and you've produced a lot of interesting kind of content about your house. So can you kind of tell us about your house? Is there a theme to how you've decorated it?
That's a very good question. I live in a 1959 house, 58 house in Sydney, designed by a guy called Bill Baker. So it's a classic modernist house with a wall of glass fronting out onto the street. And I've always liked architecture. I've always collected furniture. So almost 20 years ago, I was looking for a place to put my mid-century modern furniture, and this house turned up, and it's evolved from being a house that I lived in by myself to a house where Michelle and I have lived, and then now it's a family home with our 2 children. So it's quite modest. It's a 3-bedroom house. Had a little extension by the original owners in the early 1970s, but we are living pretty much in the footprint of a 1950s house, and it works surprisingly well considering its age. You know, while we're recording this is winter in Sydney, and it's been a little colder than normal, and it's got a few drafts. But what Australian homes don't, I suppose, is the answer to that. In terms of our aesthetic, it's full of things that we love and that mean something to us, is probably the best way of putting it. Some of those things some would see as being period specific, and others aren't, because the house is a modernist house, a mid-century modern house. Certain furniture fits here perfectly, but there's things that I've just sort of collected, Michelle's collected. There's things that represent where we've been, where we're going, the work of friends, the people that inspire us. There's great nods to nature, and also a lot of things that are around the place that are just important to us as things. There might be, next to ceramics, there might be something the kids have made out of Lego, or something that they've drawn at school, or as a photo, or something, or stones, or things that we've collected. So all of those things having equal weight, I suppose, around the place. As I sit here, I've been here a long time. There's only one thing that's still in the original place when I moved in, and that's a clock that's stuck on 8:20 that's in the spot where I put it on the day that I moved in, and it's the only thing that still sits in the same place. Some of the art's been moved around, but it's just, over a long time, things move around. There's been a couple of little renos to the place, all small things. But I suppose the house reflects what I've liked in other people's houses over the time. And I love people's homes that feel like they've had a life well lived, and that's represented in the things that they've collected over time. So it's probably a little more minimal than I would have it if I lived here by myself, to be honest. But Michelle's touch just removes some of the crap that I would chat. I think in the past I've been more of a collector, and so there's been more things around. But as time has gone on, I've been happy with less around the place, to be honest.
I suffer from a hoarding instinct, and my partner doesn't, so I actually appreciate it.
I think collecting's really interesting, and I think in the past I've felt compelled to sort of, that's good, I'm going to take that. And I think part of being a collector is being excited by something, and I'm talking about expensive things, but little bits of pottery or old phones or whatever it was. I used to sort of just grab everything and then just find a place to put it. Now I'm just happy to look at it and go, that's interesting, and I'll go, that's that, and I'll put it down and walk away. I think that's to do with my age as well. The desire to have things tends to diminish as you move along.
How important is it for these objects to have a story, or is it just more about the aesthetics, the way they fit in the home?
There's a bit of both, really. I'm just looking at something now, which is a sort of, I don't know what it is. It's a sort of sculptural screen that I bought off someone I think's got a great eye in Canberra. No one knows what it is. I doesn't really have any story other than I saw it on Instagram and I thought it would fill a place of space on the wall, and Michelle liked it as well, and it's pretty cheap. And it speaks to the 1950s without probably being from the 1950s. So yeah, everything has its moments, but the art tends to tell a story about time and place, and there are also interesting signposts from where your head was at the time. One of the, we had this list of one of the paintings I have that I didn't put on the list is a painting by a Sydney artist called Michael Muir, and I bought that painting the day that I lost a job, and which is the worst time, but the best time to buy art.
Let's mark this moment forever.
That was about me reminding myself that I was about to do something really interesting. I wanted to signpost that, and it was symbolic to myself to say, well, there is this part of my life, but what's around the corner is going to be far more interesting than that. I can't be scared of that, so I can't batten down and be concerned about those things. New great things are around the corner. You've got to hope that's going to happen. It's a difficult thing to do, but I still look at that painting, and that means a lot to me in terms of, okay, this is at this moment in time, this stopped, but it also meant something else was about to start.
I love that. We had a guest who would mark anniversaries and done it for 20 years with a painting every time. It's nice to mark it.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, we're talking about the art now, and there's like that super interesting piece behind you. Is that the M. Slater one?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that? Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what I do know about it. I bought it in a second-hand store about 20 years ago. The artist has been pretty much impossible to find, but then I've got a mate in Melbourne who sent me a photo, and he worked at a gallery for a period of time, and he was minding a friend's house, and it was almost like looking at the same painting, and for a moment I thought it was the same painting. And no, it's just one in the same series. And we're still trying to wait for his friend to try and remember where the painting came from. But I can presume if there was two in Melbourne, I'd imagine, and I got it in Melbourne, it's from this Melbourne painter. And people will, because it was sort of cheap, I leave it in a place where it can get sun damaged, which is probably not the right way of looking at it. But let's think about heritage and think about protecting paintings, and this may be one that my children feel strongly about in the future, or it may be one that is faded and they don't care. That's for them to work out, but I suppose I want my enjoyment of it to run full steam. So if that means in 20 years time it's more faded than it should be, but we get maximum usage out of it in my lifetime. Sitting where I'm sitting now is a small alto table where we have dinner, so we can see it all the time, prominent, rather than being hidden somewhere. That's a decision I'm more than happy to make, and that's the race for things to disintegrate happens with everything, whether it's a piece of paper or any sort of artwork or a piece of furniture. So ride hard or whatever that bullshit is, live strong, whatever. I don't know what the terminology for it is, but yeah, I mean. I'm sure people have views on whether or not I'm doing the wrong thing or not, but that's my philosophy with that painting.
Yeah, and you could maybe apply that to the houses as well. You can talk more about it than I can, but these kind of incredible modernist and mid-century houses are still there to be lived in, right?
Yeah, and they have to evolve over time. They change over time. People's usage of them changes over time, but it's the ideas of the house that's important. The way they make you feel, that they remind us to be progressive, that they remind us that there are different ways of living. If you live in a house like mine from the 1950s, it's more modern than many houses that are made today, which seems ridiculous, but that's the way life works.
Yeah, and you talk about the way they make you feel, and obviously I think you've talked about your own home a lot, and I feel like you've got a very emotive connection to it. I'm wondering how the art in your home plays into the emotions you feel in certain spaces.
Yeah, the art lifts the house because the architecture, like anything, if I removed everything from this house, it just becomes a shell, even if it's a nice shell. So those moments you have where you can stop and look at a painting and over time, or a drawing, or it's just a reminder of someone, which is equally as important for me. So they give you small pleasures, and I love how you can look at the same painting or piece of art every day for years and get something new from it in some way. Or sometimes you forget to look at them forever. And I often wonder about, over time, what effect that has on our kids to look at something. We didn't have much art in the house when we were kids at all, a couple of prints and bits and pieces, but we did have books. And there was a book when I was a kid called Australian Painters of the 70s, and it had John Coburn painting on the front, which I just loved, and I think that stayed with me for a long time and still does. And that's how we ended up with a Coburn tapestry. But I think without the art, the books was there, and there was less books around. There was less things to do. If you don't have devices, you don't have the internet, you read everything that's in the house. You got 4 channels on the telly when I was a kid. So you poured over everything, at least I did anyway. So that was hugely formative for me. And I wonder whether that becomes the same for our children, because there's not the using devices all the time, far from it, but whether or not they pick up on different things. My brothers probably can't remember the book on Australian painters of the 70s, but for whatever reason, it meant something to me. And I ended up doing a podcast project for the National Gallery in Canberra based on that book, and about how it's called Constant. It's a lovely series. It's about how art's a constant in our lives. I always talk about, people going to their grandparents' place and they've got just a poster they got from an exhibition they went to at the NGV or something, and how that can sit on a fridge and that can introduce you to art in different ways. I'm not an expert, far from it. I just like things that I like. I like people who create things, and I like to support them. So I just like architecture. I like how certain things make you feel, and I like how, I suppose, my interest in galleries as public spaces and places that you can escape or you can feel comfortable, or most importantly, that are free and for everyone. And I think that's really important. So you get these great hits of architecture, great hits of art, and you can go there for a school excursion, or you can go there with your laptop and work for nothing if you want as well. So they're wonderful sanctuaries, and my only concern is that sometimes people don't feel that they're welcome in them.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Part of Bluethumb was to make art more accessible, I think, to people who feel a bit intimidated by being in a gallery, or, calling themselves a collector. Even people who buy art often, won't call themselves an art collector, because you're assumed that you have to know heaps to be one.
We all I did it then, didn't I? The disclaimer. We all do the disclaimer.
Yeah. Well, Australians do, I think. If you go to America, you'll meet a 17-year-old who's an art collector. Do you think of yourself as an art collector?
No. If I was, I'd have more art and I'd buy more regularly. I suppose that's because I think about people who I know are collectors, who are constantly looking at things, thinking about things, going to exhibitions or openings all the time. And I'll go to things, but not constantly, and I'm not keeping an eye on the movements and things. But I don't separate collecting art from collecting furniture or photos, or it's just part of things that we put around us that give us joy. And I think that's sort of the Melburnian in me, where you're into everything.
Yeah.
That's what you grow up with. So you can, like footy, but like the arts as well. It's just part of that sort of wonderful cultural backdrop that you grow up in Melbourne, I think.
Yeah. And amongst those things that you've got in your home in terms of art and furniture, I think, is there a piece that sort of defines sort of the beginning of you collecting things, do you feel?
That's a good question. I've got a Grant Featherston chair that was probably the first one that I bought, and I found it in Christchurch in this funny little shop. And then I was in two minds whether I was going to recover it or not, because once you recover a chair, the chair changes forever. But it was starting to get worn, and I had a whole bunch of chairs when my kids, when they were sort of monkeying around when they were toddlers, their little tummies took the fabric off front of all the chairs. And so we had a couple that we recovered, and I'm glad we did. But Michelle, my wife, managed to she did two things. She found the fabric to replace that chair pretty much like for like. And also I had a mid-century three-legged stool that was in my mum's house. It was in her bedroom when I was a kid. And I took it from her because she didn't want it anymore. And Michelle found the same sort of colour fabric to recover that. When I look at that, it's beautiful because it reminds me of something. It's always a constant reminder of my mother and the house that I grew up in. Maybe there's probably things that I love that I might have moved on that probably started my collection. You know, I had some art that I bought 20 years ago that's not in the walls anymore, but it might come out again at another stage. But I don't know. It's sort of how your taste changes or things don't suit anymore for whatever reason.
And a lot of the sort of content that you make and even your stand-up now in the modernist houses, you often are focusing on that mid-century period, that golden age of design. Do you have the same affinity for art from then versus getting art from people right now, contemporary and living, or you just get what aesthetically kind of speaks to you art-wise?
I think sometimes there's a few things that I've collected historically just for my personal worldview. Like I made a film for one of my television shows about the Sid Ball's house and Lynn Eastaway's house. Both great artists, one far more successful than the other. And I was in Sid's studio, which is still there attached to the house. And it's basically as he left it. And it's like walking into a great artist's museum. And I was flicking through a few things, and there was a print that I quite liked. It was pretty moth-eaten, which I sort of liked. And I had a chat to the gallery and said, oh, look, I really like this. And they had another one of them, and they didn't want to sell me the one that was sitting in the studio, which I sort of wish I did because that was the one that I liked, but I understand their point of view. And then I went and got it framed. And I was talking to my framer about it, and I said, oh, can you give me one of those silver or gold frames like they were doing in the 70s? And he said, yeah, like one of those silver ones. They used to put the Whiteleys in. They're shit, but no one would do it today. So he sort of got it, which was great. And I love that painting because it's a connection to something that I've done. Yeah. An understanding that I spent a bit of time rolling around in Sid's house and being around his artwork and, you know, getting to know him through his stories and his architecture and his art. So I love that from that point. But while I was also there, Lynn was talking about her practice. And I bought a couple of pieces of Lynn's work, and then I bought some for the team that worked on the TV show as well. And I'm incredibly fond of Lynn, and I'm incredibly fond of her work. She was one of Sid's students. She's much younger than Sid, but they built the house together, and then they'd only lived there for a year or something when they split, and Sid remained, and then she left, and then they reconnected later on in life as friends, and then when he died, the house always remained known as the Ball Eastaway house, but she moved back into the house, and she spent more time now in the house than she did initially. And I was attracted to that story in lots of ways, and she lives with all of Sid's things, and then slowly she adds more of her own art around the place. She shares a lot of her life and how difficult it was for her as a female painter in the 1970s and 80s, and how she felt like she had to paint like the blokes. And then she managed over time to let that go and find her own voice in the way that she paints. So that little piece we've got that I look up from our dining room, which is just a sort of sculptural piece that she made out of linen, is a constant reminder of a generous host, a thoughtful person, and a person who shared a lot of her life and a lot of her time with me and continues to do that. Yeah. And it works both ways. I've gained a lot from making older friends through some of my projects, and Lynn's definitely one of those.
Yeah, but a constant project that you did, you know, was one of many, as we talked about maybe before we started the podcast, on the cars and stamps and everything that you've kind of made different series about. It kind of seems like you just find a topic that you're interested in, and you get the opportunity to deep dive into it.
That no one else is really interested in. And I was like, you know, sometimes you do, but I did this little stamp book because I became quite obsessive about how Australian stamps used to look great, and now they look shit. And because when I was a kid, my father collected stamps, my brothers collected stamps, and of course they're little pint-sized artworks for little brains and little minds. and I just loved them. And then, of course, it didn't happen by chance. When I started doing a deep dive into this, you realise that I'm talking about in the 1970s. There was a guy called Arthur Leedon. He was a fabulous graphic designer, and he was in charge of putting our postage stamps together, and he assembled a whole bunch of really great graphic designers to design stamps. And of course, yeah, so if you get good people designing stamps, we're going to end up with great stamps. So these things didn't just happen by chance. There was particular choices made. And of course, now we don't make those choices. We don't get our best and brightest graphic designers to make postage stamps. I'm just going to find this quote for you because it's really important. Yeah, design in connection with postage stamps and coinage may be described, I think, as the silent ambassadors on national taste.
Love that.
W.B. Yeats. And so, like, I love that. And of course, and so when your banknotes and coins or your stamps don't reflect the art at our best, it shows that there's something wrong with our nation.
Yeah. You know, this is way off topic, but no, I've got something to add.
Good. I like this.
On Twitter, they showed the American Olympic official clothes, and they're designed by Ralph Lauren, and they look incredible. They look amazing. Then I looked up the Australian ones, and not to rag on ASICS, but they do not look anywhere.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, we should take design seriously as a nation. And, you know, we're sending our Olympians, and look how America look. They look like this just amazing classic American kind of tailoring and stuff. And I was like, oh, and it's exactly a similar point with the stamps, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some would argue that our kit is hampered by the green and gold, but there have been times when it's been much better. Yeah, I agree. Wouldn't it be fabulous if everyone was talking about, wow, did you see what the Australians were wearing? Kids from all over the world go, yeah, I want to buy that. I want that because they've got the coolest kit going around. But yeah.
Bring back Mambo, the year 2000.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because it speaks of who we are. Yeah. I agree.
That series you did, Constant, so you got to deep dive into kind of 5 really notable and some kind of less known artists in Australia. Did you come away wanting to collect all their work, or that was just more like interesting to find out about them?
Yeah, I did one on Leonard French, and it was based on a sculpture that was at my university when I was studying there. And when I returned for the 50th anniversary to host an event, none of the teaching staff or none of the students that I was there with were there. So the only familiar things were the buildings and the public artworks. They're things you sort of don't recognise at the time. And I think I'm deeply interested in the idea that when you're a kid, there's a piece of public art that somehow you sort of see but don't see. And then later on in life, you go, oh, hang on a second, I remember that. Or that looks similar to something I remember. It was in the city or somewhere, or I saw that out of the train. And it can inspire little kids going into the city, holding hands with mum and dad and seeing something. You know, those kids running around a Lindy Lee sculpture can be incredibly important for them when they're little.
And you talk about sort of things coming back to you later on, sort of art and architecture. Do you see anything in contemporary design that you think that will sort of come back to, and maybe in the next 50 years, and sort of only realise then how important it is to us?
Yeah, it's a good question. There'll be always things that you discount at the time, and then in retrospect you realise it's better than it is. You do it with music all the time. I didn't really get it at the time, and then, oh, hang on a second, I get it now. Sometimes we have to wait for people to catch up to see it. And that's the legacy of great art, isn't it? That it can be even more contemporary 70 years, 80 years later, or it still has a resonance or only finds its feet, you know, after the artist is gone. Sad for them, but great for the art. But I suppose from the grave, you'd be pretty pleased about that.
Neil Van Gogh, finally.
Yeah, plenty of them.
Yeah. So your latest kind of project, or one of your latest projects, is a fiction book, Scorcher. You're obviously a storyteller. I mean, you've been doing this your whole career, but was it daunting stepping into the role of like, I'm a fiction writer, or it was just another interesting project to do?
Sorry, I missed you there, George. It was my first work of fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was. Apart from a little story here and there, it's got some memoir in it as well. But there was just it was a particular time. It was during one of the lockdowns, and it was like where I was projecting myself where I wanted to be. It was winter, and I was trying to conjure up the spirit of summer. And it was when I realised that if you can land something at the right time in the right place, and it was like the most perfectly timed book. I released it just as everyone was coming out of lockdown, going into summer, at Christmas time. And where my head was at was where everyone else's head wanted to be as well. It did incredibly well. And I think because I wasn't doing much else, so I had a bit of time to perfect it, I think. So that probably helped as well.
Was it daunting saying, I'm going to do fiction now? Or it was, you've been telling stories your whole career, it's fine?
Yeah, I mean, I've got over worrying about what people might think. Just do things that make me happy.
Yeah.
And if you're in the public eye in varying degrees, most of the things that I do are less visible than they once were before. So putting out a book's far more revealing, but in many ways far less revealing than telling a story on the radio when you've got 500,000 people listening or something like I did back in the day.
Yeah.
You talk about sort of being in the public eye there and putting your ideas or yourself out there as well. What was it that sort of made you initially use your platform to start talking about the sort of conservation, I guess, of sort of mid-century modern architecture, as well as the history of our sort of built environments? Was there something that particularly made you start to use your platform for that?
It's something that's always been important to me, and when Instagram came along, it enabled me to reach a whole bunch of different people and meet a whole bunch of people that shared interests. And so that sort of enabled this sort of second act of my career and created all sorts of opportunities that probably would have taken a lot longer. When I was working with Merrick, it was a pretty successful duo, and I was incredibly proud of what we did. When I stopped doing that, it was either I had one half of that or I did a whole of something new. And so that basically drove everything that I wanted to do. I wanted to have a different life, and I wanted to have a probably culturally more enriching life, and that was a huge driver. And I started seeking out people and organisations that I wanted to work with and I wanted to do things with based on what interested me. And that stays the same. So predominantly, if I'm interested in something, if I'm curious about something, I'll seek those things out. And a lot of that's been with our great cultural institutions. And so I've been really lucky over the last 10 years to work with the various libraries, the Sydney Living Museum, the National Gallery, the National Archives, and then, of course, clearly with the ABC as well, which is a really important cultural institution as well.
Yeah. Is there a curiosity that you're still hoping to do a deep dive into?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in different housing forms and models at the moment. Affordable housing, better social housing, things that are really top of mind for Australians. And sadly enough, the idea that housing affordability isn't really a design issue. It's so much deeper than that. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at different models that make things a little bit easier. But the forces are against so many young Australians or older Australians when it comes to buying a house. And it's a huge part of who we are is just disappearing in front of us. And it's happened really slowly, but it's also happened really quickly, which is quite a curious paradox.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think about that a lot as well. It's interesting, the sort of different housing and social kind of housing models. In Melbourne, there's Nightingale who develop interesting multi-res housing. But overseas, there are a bunch of examples from different countries around that. Would you ever think about travelling and looking at what works in other places versus here for that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just in Denmark looking at some. I was in the UK looking at some, and they were older ones rather than the newer ones. But yeah, of course, dream just to roll around looking at social housing models and working out what works. But I'd have to have a more definitive project aligned to that. But yeah, I mean, we've got to change something here. We really do.
With something like that, can you come up with, I've got an amazing travel show. It looks at housing in all the different spots of the world, and you just go and pitch Netflix or something? Is this how it works?
No, it doesn't. And they say, I don't really know what no one cares about. I don't know. Maybe they do. Architecture on telly is pretty hard.
Okay.
There's not. If you look around, there's not a lot of it.
Yeah.
Outside of
Grand
renos
designs.
and lifestyle shows, which are important and people love. And that's where the audience is. But I think there's an audience outside of television. There's socials, there's YouTube, there's all sorts of different ways you can share your projects these days.
And then I suppose in terms of sort of conservation efforts or, bringing attention to social housing issues, do you think that there's anything that we could all be doing in our day-to-day lives to sort of highlight any of those issues?
I think if the people are really passionate about a building in their own neighbourhood, you just fight to save it. All the best battles are won at a local level. I see a lot where there's people who come together to fight to save a building, and sometimes they don't win, but in that process they meet a whole bunch of people who really care about something, and those relationships and friendships that are formed through those battles are really important, and they tend to roll up and try and save the next one. So, you lose one, maybe you'll get the next one. It's becoming increasingly harder and harder in this country, that's for sure.
Any other design niches you would go into? Like you did stamps and cars, art. Is there anything else that kind of...
No, not at the moment, but you never know. Not that I can think of the top of my head, but you'll know about it as soon as... I'm doing a new book on, something or other from the great stubby hole makers, the 1960s. It's a craft industry.
Sounds like something I would read.
Yeah, it might be something in it for about 5 people.
Yeah. Cool. And so I guess you probably can't talk about any of the stuff you're working on right now that's not out, right? Because it sounds like you probably have a few irons in the fire.
Oh, there's always something going on. But mostly this year's I'm doing a bunch of live work, which I'm really enjoying. And I'm also just going to see things. I'm taking the time to be inspired. So I'm seeing lots of houses. I'm having lots of conversations with people, because the best stories aren't online. They're stories that people tell you when you meet them. So that's what I've learned over the years in terms of informing my process for whatever project I'm working on. So I love meeting people and talking to them about their lives and their homes or their careers, and then that helps shape the next project that I'm working on.
Fantastic. And you're still doing the Man About the House tours at the moment, right?
Yes. Yeah, I've got Motel, which is great, because I did this motel exhibition and a motel book talking about other things that I did a deep dive on. And then we wrote, and it all started with this great show, which is this nostalgic look at holidays of the past. It's with my best mate, Kit Warhurst, who's a great musician. And I think it's probably our most accessible show, and people just love it. So we're bringing that back again for a run of shows. It's got history, it's got comedy, it's got great songs in it. It's like
fantastic.
And it's super nostalgic, so people love it.
I would have seen Rocket Science about 10 times, I reckon, as a kid.
Well, there you go. Thank you for doing that. Kid would appreciate that. Don't stop going to see them. They're still playing.
Yeah. Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thanks, Tim, so much for jumping on. It's been a great chat.
Yeah, well, gentlemen, thank you for having me on, talking about everything.
Yeah.
Stamps, art.
Holidays.
It's funny because, as I speak, because I'm speaking from my house where I can see all the things that I've been talking about, I'm looking around at things going, oh, yeah, that's interesting. Oh, maybe I can move that around. Oh, I'm not sure about that piece of art. Maybe that needs to be retired. Maybe that clock that's been stuck on 8:20 for almost 20 years. Is it time for that to move on? Would anyone notice? Lots of questions have been posed in my mind during this podcast.
Lots of thinking.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, mate.
Thanks, gents. Appreciate your time.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tim.